Welcome to the Only Healthcare podcast, where today we're going to have a continued conversation based on the discussions that took place at the Nicholas Hall North American Conference, talking about the additional condition non-prescription use, or ACNU. So we're going to go through some of the questions and provide some answers to what the live audience brought up during those panels. And we're going to start with our team from Biograph, Mary Alice Lawless, Chelsea Ryan, and Ted Lawless. So we're going to start with Mary Alice to address the question of talking through the origin of the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, their rule for additional conditions for non-prescription use, the ACNU rule, and the public health mandate behind it.
Sure, Randy. Thank you. Well, more than a decade ago, FDA posted a notice in the Federal Register seeking what they called at the time solutions that might ensure consumer safety in the selection and/or use of non-prescription drug products for many common and chronic conditions. They were at the time talking about concerns around high cholesterol, hypertension, asthma, migraine, and other conditions. The FDA was primarily reacting to the body of evidence that showed massive undertreatment in these conditions and others due to really non-compliance with prescription therapy. The agency did its own research and found that the requirement to obtain a prescription for appropriate medications and to be making visits back and forth to a healthcare practitioner may have been contributing to this undertreatment. And the trend of undertreatment was causing, poor health outcomes for Americans, was increasing costs for patients and for the healthcare system, and added burden to the already overburdened, and now we know even more so overburdened, provider system in our country. So, as FDA was going through this process of thinking about how could they get more folks to be treating their conditions, they also found that there were those who never even sought any kind of medical care and never even started prescription drug therapy. And when they drilled down in the research, they found it was back to these same issues of sort of cost and time required to see a healthcare provider for either the initial diagnosis or the initial prescription or refills. People just didn't have the bandwidth. And many of these conditions were conditions that FDA felt with a little bit of support, consumers could probably be managing better on their own, and we may not see as much drop-off. So the FDA believed that, again, a lot of the need to see doctors and making visits and driving people through this, office process and then to the pharmacy could be eliminated if some of these products could be made available with what FDA defined as an additional condition for safe use. And in fact, the agency thought that if we added these conditions of safe use, we would thereby be sort of empowering consumers, consumers, to use the drug products that they needed safely and effectively without the ongoing involvement of their healthcare provider. As I mentioned, those conditions, you can think about high cholesterol, treating high cholesterol, or even hypertension, or even asthma. These are ongoing chronic use prescriptions. And for the most part, the patient/consumer, when they're not in front of a doctor, is managing that condition on their own. So making access to the medications that they need just made all the sense in the world to FDA. And that was the genesis of what became the FDA's final rule for additional conditions for non-prescription use, or, as you said, the acronym ACNU. And it's really a regulatory pathway for non-prescription registration and drug access. So today, that was 12 years ago that FDA started on this mission. Today we have the rule, and the rule became effective just this past May 27th, 2025. And certainly we need it because undertreatment continues to impose a crushing burden and soaring costs on the U.S. healthcare system. This current year, 2025 data shows that 50% of patients prescribed chronic medications still fail to stick to their treatment plans. And their non-adherence is linked to a significant increase in hospitalizations, treatment failures, And right now, the CBO estimates 125,000 preventable deaths annually in the US. So that's really important that we pay attention to this. This rule, as far as the White House is concerned, as far as the Office of Management and Budget and HHS are concerned, is deregulatory. That means that it's meant to relieve the, public of, undue burden of policy and so on, and empower them to be self-efficacious. So as far as the, regulators and the policymakers are concerned, the rule does expand access. It removes a requirement that a physician be supervising every refill of a prescription, and would complement that physician oversight of the condition with access to this medication with an additional condition. And with the additional condition, it essentially relaxes some of the labeling constraints. The label for an OTC right now is called a drug facts label. That's the way the FDA has drug sponsors communicate with consumers who buy the product. And what we're seeing with this whole new segment of opportunity really in drug access is that there is a new way to communicate potentially with the appropriate consumers, and that's through this additional condition that will communicate the important information that a printed drug facts label just cannot reinforce adequately. So we have a new rule. It's just recently been made effective. And, there are almost limitless opportunities to expand drug access and lower costs for people, patients, and for the U.S. healthcare system.
Well, thanks for that little history lesson. It's amazing what can happen over a long period of time within the government organizations. So it's nice to see that finally we were able to get from that initial genesis for getting this rule put into place in 2025. So the question is, what is the opportunity for a manufacturer or drug companies in the ACNU rule? And I understand the pathway, unlike the traditional prescription OTC switch, allows the same drug to be available as both prescription and non-prescription. So another little twist to the story.
Right. It is a twist. And it's, sort of a little bit of an off-balance feeling for some of the folks who are used to the conventions of, as you say, RX to OTC switch, which basically takes a drug at that dose and for the indication out of the RX setting and says to everybody, look, you can only get this in the OTC domain. But going back to why the ACNU rule is even, part of our health law today is because the source of the public health crisis and the target market for any new non-prescription product with an ACNU is an undertreating population, right? It's not just because we can make the product available and cheaper for everybody who uses it. In fact, FDA is thinking, and we would all think this way, it's very logical. If somebody is stable and treating and managing a cardiovascular risk factor like high cholesterol and taking their statin drug on a daily basis and getting their refills and seeing their doctor, no one wants to disrupt that. That needs to stay in place to serve that market. But that is the treating population. The additional condition rule and all of the, facets that will be part of that and the experience that consumers will have in, fulfilling an additional condition and interacting with a digital interface and, answering questions and checking data and so on. That is designed to allow access for the non-treaters or the undertreaters who are having personal, outcomes, negative outcomes as a result of undertreating. And again, as I just mentioned a moment ago, just drive incredible healthcare costs when they show up at the emergency room with something that could have been managed if they had access to their medications. So no sponsor companies, whether they're the owners of the RX products or potentially sponsors, and they may be the same party, but sponsoring the non-prescription, should be concerned with simultaneous marketing because they serve different, these two drugs and these two pathways serve completely different need states and sets in terms of the consumer. The fact that we've got almost 50% of our general population with chronic conditions not adherent to therapy says that there's a massive unmet consumer need, and this non-prescription access pathway will help us to serve that need.
Yeah, so we'll cover a little bit more about the consumer implications, which, as you stated, could really be a sky-the-limit opportunity in the marketplace that we currently don't have solutions for, and expand the care for patients who need these kinds of products. So we're going to switch up a little bit and talk about some of the financial and forecasting implications. And I'm going to turn to Ted to talk about the financial picture. Specifically, a couple of the questions that came up during the live program was, how should sponsors forecast the investment for and the return on this ACNU program for existing or new products? So Ted, could you take us through that?
Yeah. Thanks, Randy. So as you just laid out, there are two parts to this question, right? The first, a sponsor will have to consider new assumptions for calculating the investment in order to develop these new drugs. They'll need to do the same as they forecast the market of the planned product, but we'll get to that in a second. So if we start with the investment, traditionally OTC switch programs can be very hard to predict, total investment. From the outset, you don't know exactly how long they're going to take and how much effort is going to have to go into it. And that's mostly due to the nature of, studying consumer behavior and the studies that we, typically use at this point. We see that recently. We've seen that with many programs where sponsors are repeating studies, and there's always this hope that the next study will achieve the results that the agency requires in order to move to the next stage of the approval process. As sponsors think about ACNU programs, they should anticipate significant savings, and that's due to the engineering process of the ACNU. In the final rule, the FDA states that these additional conditions will operate based on an underlying algorithm. It's going to map out the step-by-step process of going through the additional conditions in what will be essentially a care intervention. Once the FDA signs off on that algorithm and the sponsor negotiates it back and forth with FDA on paper first, then the programming of the software begins. And then what gets studied, it's a test of the software to execute the algorithm rather than consumer behavior in an unknown and unpredictable way. So, that represents a pretty significant and meaningful difference from the OTC switch programs we have today. And what that means for sponsors is that they can anticipate greater speed to approval, greater cost containment, maybe a more efficient process, and ultimately that will lead to an increase. The metric that we use is probability for technical and regulatory success. So an increased expectation of success. So, in summary, on the investment side, what we believe, is that the ACNU program gives sponsors more control of the high cost variables in the program, which allows, the sponsor companies or outside investors to be more confident investing in these products. On the second side of your question, the question about forecasting for commercial performance, even with higher certainty in the investment side and the development side, sponsors, of course, will have to know how will this product perform in market. And to forecast, you need the inputs. And in order to develop the inputs, sponsors will have to consider the significance of the reality once an ACNU product comes to market is that there's now the opportunity for a one-to-one connection with every consumer that purchases the product, right? And this is transformational, especially if you consider the traditional 3-year exclusivity period for novel non-prescription products. You now have an opportunity for a drug company to develop a relationship with their consumer in a highly personal way, more than just a mass market type of environment. So right now, prescription drugs and OTC drugs, they don't have a way of ensuring that connection. So this is a new element to the consumer experience and the relationship between a drug company and their consumers. And so only ACNU allows the marketing teams and the brand teams this new opportunity, which is, once a consumer fulfills an ACNU, makes a purchase, that brand now has the opportunity to initiate a direct relationship for as long as a person is taking the treatment. In many of these cases, that can be a lifetime. And so you're building loyalty, you're earning brand respect and esteem while also driving repeat purchasing. So again, with the idea of 3-year marketing exclusivity period generally granted to products that earn it, you now have an opportunity to build a relationship with your customers that is strong enough to withstand any future competitors that may enter the market and hopefully endure for much longer after that. So, this opportunity, we think, it offsets many of the customary costs of product advertising and promotion, right? And it allows funds to be redirected maybe to driving trial and offering additional value so that you can ensure that your consumers don't opt out of that long-term relationship and thus add lifetime value to the product in market. To summarize it, to build a legitimate commercial forecast, you've got to look at the pathways by which the product will exist in market. And sponsors will have to have a full grasp of implementation and commercialization. I should point out here that my colleagues and I here at Biograph, we've made it a strategic priority to work with our clients to build these informed and responsive forecasts to guide business decisions at the beginning of and then throughout the life of ACNU products.
Thanks for that. Nice summary on the financial implications, the planning, and the opportunity that the ACNU products represent for a manufacturer. We're going to shift one more time and get back to the consumer implications and what could be happening in the community at retail and other locations where these ACNU products may be made available. Chelsea, you're our expert on retail considerations. So why is it important that conventional brick and mortar retail is part of the plan?
So that's a good question, Randy, and one that we get quite often. So today's consumers, they want and they expect an omni-channel retail experience. Although the global pandemic has already accelerated the adoption of technology and digital capabilities, consumers are still really valuing the in-store point of purchase. So according to industry research we've seen, 49% of today's shoppers prefer a mix of online shopping and in-store. So then in terms of influence on consumer wellness purchases, we actually have a report from McKinsey that shows that in-store presence, as well as recommendations from family, friends, and doctors have the highest impact on those consumer decisions. So I actually have a quote from that report that states, "Physical stores remain important as they provide consumers with tangible experiences, instant gratification, and build brand and product credibility." And then separately, citing a survey conducted by YouGov, Drugstore News actually reports that the findings bode well for brick and mortar retail because we see a significant share of respondents prefer to buy non-prescription drugs the traditional way by going in person to the store and seeing them in person. So one note to build on this too, we're often asked where RX direct-to-patient companies fit into the ACNU strategy, and they really don't. These are business models that serve a very small and specific segment of the RX market and not the mass non-prescription market. And right now they are really focused on GLP-1s and a handful of other high-cost lifestyle RX drugs. One of the leading direct-to-patient companies that's been in the market since about 2017 reports a total subscriber base of 2.4 million people. And then on the other hand, Walmart stores serve 255 million consumers on a weekly basis. So that scale is really not comparable.
What a difference. So are consumers ready to fulfill an additional condition to access these new non-prescription drugs that could come through this FDA pathway?
So what's really interesting here, and based on some other qualitative research that was sponsored by industry, it reveals that consumers of all ages are familiar with the differences between prescription products and OTC drugs, and they see many benefits in getting access to new non-prescription drug products. The research also found that consumers recognize time savings, lower cost, and convenience as major benefits of the OTC products. Survey respondents, they're also reporting that they opted not to treat their conditions due to the hassle of getting a doctor's prescription, of finding a doctor who is available to see them and take them in a timely manner, as well as having the insurance company involved. Now, most also have experience with existing products that require an extra step. So this also includes having an ID be checked or maybe even taking a card up to the counter in order to get the product. So consumers are really not deterred by the idea of an additional condition. I should also point out that since the fielding of these research projects, consumers are increasingly using their connected devices in store and online as part of their journey to purchase these everyday products. Even more, consumers have come to expect the retail experience to be relevant, connected, and continuous. The opportunity for retail is to make the ACNU experience a common, familiar, and something that's easy to navigate for consumers both in store and online.
So it sounds like there's a real acceptance by consumers of a lot of different experiences today and utilizing different devices and pathways to navigate both the in-store and online experience to obtain these products, different from the prescription side. So a stated advantage of ACNU is knowing who the consumer is at an individual level and being able to communicate to encourage compliance. How is that different versus what a prescription or RX company could do now?
So that's another good question that we hear often as well. So doctors or prescribers are the decision maker when it comes to prescription therapy, not the patient. So therefore, RX companies communicate brand messages primarily to the medical profession. Any consumer advertising we see is really mass market message that directs patients back to their doctor or to a virtual care provider to see if the drug is right for them. So the pharma sponsor is not providing a touch point with the patient in this process. By contrast now, with non-prescription drug products, these are consumer driven. The consumers are making the decision to select and to use these products. Where the non-prescription product is approved by FDA with an ACNU, the sponsor is now obligated to create a touch point with the consumers so that additional condition can be fulfilled. Further, in the course of the ACNU intervention, the brand can invite the consumer to opt in for more support as they manage their health condition and to get education and additional information. Now, to that end, a marketed brand with an ACNU is a dynamic source of new consumer insights, patterns of use, compliance and platform information, as well as continuous communication. So then through this experience, you get to test and improve along the journey with an ACNU.
Well, it seems like we check a lot of boxes around the consumer and improving that experience, which could get us back to that original stated goal that Mary Alice talked about in the beginning of the conversation, and then allow for that financial modeling to actually come true and deliver the financial as well as the patient outcomes results that everybody's looking for by expanding this marketplace. Mary Alice, there was another key question that came out of the Nicholas Hall conference that you may be able to answer. How flexible do you expect FDA to be in accepting simple self-report questionnaires to enable access by less affluent populations?
I did see that question, and it's an interesting question. Let me try to unpack it a little bit. First of all, an additional condition for non-prescription use as defined by FDA in the rule, there's 7 parts to it in terms of what has to be submitted in the NDA to FDA. Lots of acronyms there. It's much more than a questionnaire. So questionnaires go way back. At the conference, we talked a little bit about the Mevacor attempt, which is a statin drug, the attempt by Merck and J&J to together try to switch a statin drug. And there were lots of questionnaires that were a part of that. So that idea goes back many, many years. And it's not that the idea of asking the consumer questions and having the consumer, respond is bad. It's just that that's not going to do it. That's not enough. A couple of things, an additional condition is required. It's not optional. So it can't be this, sort of like, here's a little sheet, answer some questions, and, as one of our colleagues says, mark your own homework and see if you pass or not, and then decide if you're going to buy the product. I mean, that's not really what FDA is looking for here. As, one of my colleagues said today, I think, Ted, this is a care intervention. And we really need to approach it with, the rigor of a care intervention in that, number one, we know when it's delivered, we know what the outcome is, and the data is tracked. Those are all just aspects of a care intervention that cannot be overlooked. So, in that process, as I say, sort of a self-report questionnaire, not going to cut muster with FDA. What FDA wants is some kind of objective verification. FDA wants us to use the incredible amount of data we have in our healthcare system that is now completely interoperable, and use it to the benefit of the consumer in these situations. FDA wants the consumer to be educated in the process. They actually do like the idea of a conversation or an automated care aspect to the intervention, because they want the consumer to know what's going on. They don't want data to just be checked in the background and the consumer really doesn't know how they got to the end result, whether it's access to the product or a suggestion, a labeling instruction to ask a doctor before use or do not use. So a self-report questionnaire on its own can't meet any of this standard. We believe that it's a good part of the whole. It may have there may be some element of the term questionnaire in an additional condition program, but it's not the complete program. The second part of the question, I find it a little interesting to assume that something having to do with affluence could affect who would be successful with an additional condition. Of course, that's not the way FDA sees it. FDA is looking for all comers. That's, sort of a term that's used. They are very, very rigorous in terms of, making sure and testing and having sponsors test their communications for access to low literacy populations. FDA is really interested in some translation or multiple language options, all of which today with the technology and so on that we've got is not difficult. So, it is not the case that there's anything having to do with a level of affluence, and it is not the case that consumers, or we would expect any consumers to be unsuccessful, implementing or fulfilling this additional condition, because of their literacy standard or their language barriers or other things. In fact, the approach we have at Biograph with what we've put together, the BXA solution, is intended to provide and leverage the same friction-free capabilities and methods that are used by all kinds of rural hospitals, health plans, and actually, medical practices across the nation to administer care interventions. These automated care interventions are a real part of our healthcare system. They, create a lot of productivity gains for practices and hospitals and help patients stay on track. So we're talking about bringing a lot of that capability, which is now friction-free, which is familiar to consumers, bringing it now down to the non-prescription access use case and applying it there. And so, for sponsors, what that particular aspect means, just to bridge to this, I think it's an important point to make, is that we see additional condition programs being what we say riding the rails of the existing healthcare system. There's no capital investment required to access the vast and unparalleled, capabilities and health technology that would be available to underpin an ACNU. In fact, there really, and some companies have looked into this, but pretty much they've come back and reported even directly to us, there's no amount of capital investment that could replicate the clinical and operational quality of what we already have working on the healthcare system, across the healthcare system. So the idea is to just join that system and leverage some of those capabilities for the purposes of helping more consumers, stay on drug treatment with non-prescription access.
Okay, so given both aspects of that question, I have kind of an add-on to that. Given the novelty of ACNU, what is the process for a drug sponsor? How do they actually get started?
Well, the truth is there are probably companies starting at different points. But here's something that we are just observing right now, which is, there's the rule and the thinking behind the rule, the incredible work of FDA behind this rule is such that it takes a little while to sort of ingest that into an enterprise. So we actually recommend that, companies a little bit just take a moment to get together, cross-functional teams, et cetera, and really develop a shared institutional understanding or way of thinking about an internal way of talking about ACNU. It's really important because the internal teams need to be aligned before anything else can happen. And that needs to be, top to bottom. So we're talking about executive committees, all the way down to the operational teams and out to, sort of customer and market facing teams. It's also, it genders tremendous confidence in the organization when everybody is working from what they believe is at least a position of knowledge concerning the rule and its rationale and the requirements. So there's some groundwork that sort of needs to be laid. It doesn't have to be a lengthy process, but it's worth doing, sort of like a mission statement around this. Then we work with enterprise teams. And as I say, they're typically very cross-functional because, as Ted has said, as Chelsea said, and as we talked about, at the conference, there are so many dimensions to an ACNU program. It's not just a regulatory team working on this. The commercial teams want to be and should be involved, and the financial teams and, very much cross-functional supply chain others, because they all have to weigh in on the plan on paper, as Ted said, so that the outcome is realized according to that plan. So we like to work with them to really think about, number one, what are some best practices that we can use here? So if the DFL, one label on the side, on the box of a product or on the actual bottle or container of the product, isn't going to do enough to communicate all of the information that a consumer needs to have, what else do we have to do? So I already talked a little bit about objective verification. What about, an FDA calls these pain points. What about the pain points on the label? So for example, if there's an instruction, let's say it has to do with, LDL levels, can anything be objectively verified? Or a question of, are you taking another statin drug right now? We can ask the consumer that. We all know consumers don't always know their drugs by drug class or even name. So objectively verifying some of those criteria at the individual level is very important. So it's sort of take a look at what can be done that way. Secondly is, how can we really empower this consumer? How can we apply an automated care program and what FDA calls now additional labeling? Everything that the consumer sees and reads. So perhaps in a questionnaire kind of format, and any answers they can provide, that's all considered additional labeling. And so how can we use that aspect of a program? What data do we need to be able to access? What do we need to have interoperability with? And where do we need to push and send various data? One of the promises and really interesting and exciting things about the additional condition pathway, unlike today's OTC market, is that because this is a digital experience for the consumer and it is an intervention, there will be data recorded, and that data can be now pushed back into that individual's health records so that providers in the future, when they look at their medication history, they'll see these non-prescription products in that history. And so mapping out the data journeys is another really important part. What is the retail plan? Chelsea just talked about how important it is to be out there in the mass market. If somebody shops at Kroger and uses the Kroger pharmacy for their prescriptions and buys their Kroger non-prescription products in the front of that store, well, then you want to be at Kroger, and you want to be at Walmart, and you want to be on Amazon, of course. And, really that retail strategy has to be laid out. And again, it's important to do it at the beginning, even if it changes a little bit. It's important to have that as a base of the plan. And then how that operationalization, which is a term FDA uses and wants to understand, this is a description of how the product goes to market, that needs to be included in the NDA application to FDA, and how that will take place at scale has to be considered at the very beginning, because you wouldn't want to set up a situation where you don't have enough scale to serve the full market. So from there, most companies are either thinking about or already work in certain disease states and know a little bit about what products really might be attractive to their portfolios. But there's a deep dive that has to be done on all of that, really, to understand do we commercialize products that perhaps we already own via this pathway, or do we out-license those, or do we partner to bring those products to market? There are all kinds of business model questions that have to be answered. And as I mentioned, there are companies starting at different points here. So there are some companies that have been really struggling with traditional Rx to OTC switch programs. They were trying to bring products to market before we had the new rule, and the drug facts label just couldn't do it. The nice thing is that even those programs only need a little, lift. They need to just bridge from where they are and all the work they've done and all the information and, clinical data they've collected to the ACNU pathway with, the application of certain capabilities that can be brought in and sort of used to fill gaps. So really, wherever a company is, there's a place to start. There are probably some similar, sort of learning aspects to, get the entire team aligned, but the capabilities are the same. The process is really the same. The secret sauce is what drug and how are we going to bring that drug to market, and how are we going to talk to consumers in market to really drive, a competitive proposition.
Well, thank you for taking the time today to answer some of these questions that came up during the live conference, and to not only Mary Alice, but to Ted and Chelsea to address some of the common issues that come up and were discussed either during the after meeting conversations or in the written questions that were submitted during the conference. So this will wrap up the Only Healthcare podcast episode, and we hope you enjoyed it. It answered a lot of questions for you, the audience, whether you're a consumer, a manufacturer, or drug sponsor, or any other member of the healthcare ecosystem that would be interested in pursuing and supporting ACNU products getting into the marketplace. Thank you for joining the Only Healthcare podcast. Please follow us at onlyhealthcarepodcast.com, and we look forward to having you participate in our future programs.
Thank you for tuning in to the Only Healthcare podcast. We hope you found today's episode insightful and informative. Remember, our mission is to provide actionable and inspirational insights on how we can improve healthcare cost, care, and accessibility for all. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and share with your friends and family. For more resources and updates, visit us at onlyhealthcarepodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what topics you'd like us to discuss in future episodes. Until next time, stay informed, and together, let's navigate the journey to better healthcare.